Hello, this is Professor Zafari again, and in this video I want to talk about the concept called Orientalism and then look at specifically how it relates to our study of the cultural developments of the 20th century. So let's start by looking at this term, the Orient. What geographical location does it refer to? Well, the term Orient is a Latin word simply meaning east, and we see this term used during the Roman Empire. And for the Romans, it was a term they used to refer to the eastern parts of Europe, the eastern Balkans, and anything east of that. And then as history goes by, later Europeans start using the term the Orient to refer to further and further territories eastward. And as Western explorers travel into the further reaches of what we would now call the Far East, they start expanding the use of this term. So the use of the term the Orient in the early 20th century, in 1900, 1910, a European or an American using the term the Orient would be referring to a vast region, a really huge region that is simply referring to a region east of them. And it's a region that includes most of Asia as well as the Middle East. So it's really a term that is very grand, very large in its reference, and not very specific. I also start to see many of the European travelers coming back home with these descriptions of lands they've traveled across the Orient. And so we see depictions of, quote, the Orient in paintings. We see them in scenes such as this. And which country it is, which region it is, which cultural characteristic the artist is trying to capture is not evident, but it's this depiction of the Orient that starts to capture the European imagination. So with the use of this term then, we expand it to create Oriental. And this adjective then has been used by the West, by Western Europeans and Americans, to refer to those cultures and those people that are in that vast general region called the Orient. So people who are from that region could be called Oriental. And another term that starts to become used by Western Europeans and Americans is this term Mongoloid. And they use it as a racial category to refer to East Asians, Central Asians, and Southeast Asians. And of course today we would consider that a pretty offensive term, but at that time, the early 20th century, nobody thought about it. But because of the fact that we're using this term Oriental does not distinguish what country somebody's from, what culture characterizes them, it tends to be something that people consider derogatory. And adding to this, the United States has a history of discrimination against Chinese and Japanese immigrants. So many people began to consider the term Oriental to be derogatory. So it's a term that has evolved in its use and now is considered a pretty derogatory term. So depictions of the Orient and Oriental people can range from something like this to something like this. And for the Europeans whose imagination was inspired by these exotic lands called the Orient, it didn't really matter. It was just this big bundled exotic image of the Orient. And so we start to see this genre of art and literature that is Orientalism. It is this genre of 19th century scholars who are writing about the Orient or are painting about the Orient. And the trend initially develops trying to capture this curiosity and trying to know about these people that the Europeans are conquering. And what happens over time is that this genre becomes popular. It's really interesting to see these exotic locations with these exotic decorations and these men playing chess in a cafe such as this one, or a woman who is robed in a really beautiful way. And what happens over time then is this genre continues. And in the 20th century, one of the most significant writers and intellects on this topic is Edward Said. And he writes that this trend of European explorers, artists, writers trying to depict the Orient in this exotic way becomes a trend that he coins the term to be called Orientalism. And what he says then is that the Orient becomes a European invention, and a European invention that serves their curiosity and serves their desire for adventure. And so the Orient becomes this place of romance, of exotic people and haunting memories and landscapes. And so what starts to happen then is that these depictions are less and less realistic, they are more and more stereotypical, and he says as a result, they are more and more offensive. So some of those examples of Orientalism, of stereotypes that develop are, for example, the sexually lascivious or sexually repressed people of the Orient. These stereotypes we start to get of Arab and or Muslim men as terrorists. These depictions of Chinese women as being a dragon lady. And we get all of these stereotypes that he says are rather demeaning. So here's a common stereotype we see in Orientalist paintings. The woman who is usually fully nude or partially nude, who is depicted as an object of sexual desire, and what her true function is we don't know, but it serves the European imagination. And what Edward Said argues is that the problem with Orientalism is that it reduces the humanity of the indigenous people. Rather than looking at the true cultural characteristics and studying them to perhaps honor or respect those cultures, it diminishes these people into a stereotype. And with that stereotype, then, we get this concept that they are biologically inferior, that they're culturally backward, that they're just weird, they're too different and peculiar from us. And so we start to see that with these depictions then, it is the European who is more powerful and superior, and it is these Oriental people who are backward. And these ideas serve to validate the imperial colonizing missions of the West. And these ideas, as they serve to validate the political goals of the Europeans, they also came to be very entertaining. And so we see these paintings become more and more popular. We see them enticing the European imagination. Even with the development of photography, we continue this trend, depicting women in these exotic ways or depicting scenes in this provocative way. And we start to see it in film. So it's a trend that continues into the 20th century. Here's a scene, for example, from a film called Indian Tomb. Indian Tomb. What are we seeing here? We're seeing people whose race or ethnic identity is not very clear. Stereotypical dress, for example. We see this who's supposed to be perhaps a Hindu goddess depicted in the background, very sexually provocative. And here's
Es scheint, als habest du schwere Schuld auf dich geladen, Sita. Wir, die Diener des Tempels, können nicht in dein Herz sehen. Das kann nur sie, die Erhabene.
Skipping ahead, you can see in this film that she's not a very Asian-looking woman. She's a European actress, of course, or an American actress. But there's no correct depictions of this culture. We get this cobra that's going to be enchanted by this woman who's going to perform her snake charming ritual. To her dance, and notice how she's dressed. From what we know of most Asian cultures, this is a very provocative way of dressing. But again, the way she's dressed appeals to the audience watching the film. We're not interested in depicting people correctly or with their true cultural characteristics. example of a film where we see this sword dance. Again, an American actress.
Does not their skill excite your admiration?
And the famous John Wayne in this film as well. And she's going to perform this exotic dance. Is this a cultural form of dance? No, but it is something that is meant to entice the American audience for whom this film was made. But what we want to look at as we begin our unit is we want to look at the idea of Orientalism as we look at some specific pieces of literature. I'm going to ask you to read a poem by Rudyard Kipling, and he's going to refer to Oriental people, and he's going to refer to them as half devil and half child, and he's going to refer to them as sullen peoples. And so there's that Orientalist description that the people who live east of us, the people who are not like us, are subhuman, they're inferior. And then we're going to read another thought-provoking piece of Orientalist literature, and it's by an author whose name you might recognize, George Orwell. And he writes an interesting short story called Shooting an Elephant. And he does not have such a clearly racist attitude as Rudyard Kipling, yet as he refers to the Burmese people in his short story, he doesn't refer to them as Orientals, he refers to them as Burmese, he's specific, but he still has this Orientalist perspective in that he doesn't really connect with their culture, he doesn't fully depict them as fully human, as people with emotions and people with needs and psychological realities that are just as significant as the Europeans. So there's still this tone of non-European people being the other. Even though he doesn't use the term Oriental, he still has that attitude. So we want to explore these terms as we look at these two pieces of literature. And what we'll see over the course of the 20th century is that in early 1900, the very early part of the 20th century, we're steeped in these notions of Orientalism. Americans and Europeans find it very hard, if not difficult and impossible, to recognize that people who are foreign to them are also equal. They're very much stuck in an idea that Western culture is superior to everyone else's. They do not take the time or put in the intellectual effort to study these people to see what is it that makes their culture so beautiful or valid. They simply depict them as the other. Maybe they're interesting, maybe they're exotic, maybe we can be entertained by stories about them, but we still don't see them as equals. And over the course of the 20th century, that trend will break down. It'll break down in varying degrees, and as we were looking at these examples of contemporary Orientalism, we can argue that trend isn't completely over, but by the end of the 20th century, we start to see celebrations of other people's cultures, we start to see people from these regions depicting their art, depicting their life experiences in ways that people across the world can identify with. And so this trend really significantly breaks down. So in this unit, we're going to focus on these early 20th century pieces of literature that depict Orientalist views, and through the course of the semester, we'll start to see how these views break down. Enjoy reading the next pieces of literature, and again, keep these concepts of Orientalism in the background as a cultural theme that very much informed these works of literature.